Chapter 1. The Unwelcome Arrival. St. Mary Mead awoke that morning to the gentle chime of church bells and the scent of freshly baked scones drifting from Mrs. Petherick's kitchen. The village green was alive with color. Bunting fluttered on gazebo poles, and clusters of wicker chairs circled neatly beneath rose-clad trellises. It was by any measure the perfect setting for a delightful spring fete, complete with maypole dance scheduled for noon, a stall selling jellies and jams from Mrs. Blackwood's pantry, and a modest exhibition of hats at Lady Carmichael's millinery booth. Miss Jane Marple, seated on a wooden bench beneath a blossoming cherry tree, observed the preparations with her customary calm interest. Her knitting needles clicked softly as she conversed with Raymond West, who'd driven down from London to report on one of his features for the Morning Chronicle. He fussed with the brim of his straw boater, eyes bright with journalistic zeal. "You see, Aunt Jane," he murmured, "all the usual suspects are here. Mrs. Petherick fussing over her prize begonias, Colonel Melville polishing his medals. One might expect nothing more exciting than a misplaced ribbon." Miss Marple smiled placidly. "The quieter the village, the sharper the tensions beneath," she replied. "One would do well to notice those who linger too long by the jam stall or whisper behind hands." Across the lawn, Lady Carmichael arranged hats of every shape, soft cloche styles alongside sturdy boaters, on a tiered display. A small sign read, "Please try on freely, mistakes unseen." Villagers flitted around, offering polite oohs and ahs, while the milliner herself, a prim woman with a faint accent, adjusted ribbons and feather trims with clinical precision. Just as Mrs. Petherick called for order to begin the ribbon-cutting ceremony, a sudden commotion rippled through the crowd. A high, metallic ticking drifted beneath the murmur of voices. Heads turned toward the source, and Lady Carmichael's eyes widened in alarm. From beneath the table, where a battered hatbox lay half hidden by scarves, came that unmistakable ticking, regular, insistent, and growing louder. A hush fell over the fete as villagers leaned forward, their smiles twisting into puzzled frowns. "Good heavens!" cried Mrs. Petherick, stepping back. "What on earth is that noise?" Raymond rose and leaned toward the hatbox, brow furrowed. "That's not a mechanical millinery device. It sounds like a clock." Miss Marple set aside her knitting and approached. The hatbox was cylindrical, dark leather with brass studs, its handle frayed by age. No label marked the maker. She knelt and, in a voice barely above a whisper, said, "Let us—" Before she could finish, the ticking accelerated, a rapid staccato that sent a shiver through the assembled crowd. A sharp click followed, and with a quiet pop, the lid sprang open. For a fraction of a second, no one dared to look inside. Then Lady Carmichael backed away with a shriek. Inside the brim of a worn velvet bonnet lay a small pocket watch, its face cracked and hands spinning madly. Beneath it, nestled in a nest of silk ribbons, was a rolled piece of parchment tied with thread. Miss Marple, steadying herself, reached out and extracted the note. Her eyes narrowed as she untied the string. The parchment bore a single line. "At high noon the hat must fall, and one life shall answer the call." Beneath, a crude sketch of a skull stared mournfully back. A collective gasp rose. Colonel Melville drew his sword cane, as if to defend the fete, while Mrs. Petherick clutched her heart. Lucy Pargeter, the vicar's wife, pressed her hand to her lips and whispered a prayer. Raymond flipped open his notebook, ready to scribble every detail. Miss Marple read the message once more, her calm exterior slipping into measured concentration. "A threat," she observed quietly, delivered in the most theatrical manner conceivable. She looked up, eyes sweeping the circle of stunned faces. Who placed this hatbox here, and to what purpose? The ticking had ceased, yet the villagers remained frozen, as if time itself held its breath. The pocket watch, though silent now, bore the echo of that ominous countdown, and the note's warning hung like a specter over the green. Mrs. Petherick swallowed audibly, but no one could have known the fete would begin at high noon. Miss Marple stood, smoothing her skirt with deliberate composure. Precisely. This message was meant not only to threaten but to draw attention. Someone here, someone who wished to see more than ribbons cut today, planned a spectacle. Lady Carmichael, recovering her poise, snapped her gloved fingers. "Remove it at once," she commanded to a startled footman. The hatbox was whisked away, the pocket watch and parchment taken into safe, keeping behind the staff-only tent. Yet the unease remained. The villagers, once suffused with light-hearted anticipation, now exchanged wary glances. The fate's gaiety had been ruptured by the intrusion of dark intent. Miss Marple crossed her arms, eyes thoughtful. We must consider all angles. A simple prank or a sinister promise. The choice of a hatbox, we shall learn its origin. The note's timing deliberate, and the hiding of the ticking watch meticulous. Raymond closed his notebook with a snap. I never thought I'd see such drama in St. Mary Mead. I'll find out where that box came from. Miss Marple nodded, her gaze settling on the milliner, who hovered at the fringes of the crowd, her expression guarded. Observe how our friend handles this disturbance. Those who remain calm may hide the deepest secrets. As the clock tower in the village square struck 9, its chimes echoing across the green, the hint of menace lingered like fog. A single life to answer the call at noon, a cryptic promise that would shape every heart present. And at the center of it all, Miss Marple's keen mind began weaving threads between hat ribbons and whispered fears, preparing to untangle the riddle before the hour of reckoning. Chapter 2. Whispers and Suspicions. By mid-morning, the garden fete had resumed its gentle bustle, but the air trembled with the aftershock of the ticking hatbox. Villagers wandered among the stalls with cautious glances, as though the very ground might conceal another unwelcome surprise. Mrs. Petherick hovered by her begonias, her earlier delight replaced by a pallid determination to maintain decorum. Colonel Melville watched the ribbon cutters with a newly tense jaw, and Lady Carmichael had ensconced herself behind her millinery tent, peering out as if guarding her precious hats from unseen hands. Miss Marple, seated once more beneath the cherry tree, observed the scene with a quiet intensity that went unnoticed by most. Beside her, Raymond West scribbled furiously in his notebook, reconstructing every tremor of the crowd's fear. At her side, Lucy Pargeter, newly returned from quietly admonishing the vicar to pray for calm, sipped her tea in small, fidgeting sips. "I cannot fathom who would resort to such theatrics," murmured Lucy, her gaze flickering toward the empty space where the hatbox had stood. It was hardly in the spirit of fellowship. Miss Marple inclined her head. Precisely. A threat so conspicuous must serve two purposes: intimidation and the planting of doubt. Those who hear the ticking remember its sound more than its source. She paused over her knitting. Now, we must listen to the theories of the village. Across the lawn, Mrs. Petherick cleared her throat and raised her voice. Ladies and gentlemen, let us not allow one ill-considered prank to mar our entertainment. Please, gather round for the maypole dance. A ripple of polite applause followed. Parents shepherded children into position around the slender pole, while villagers arranged themselves in a loose ring. Yet as the ribbons twined around the maypole, whispers darted from cluster to cluster. Near the jam stall, Mrs. Blackwood muttered to her friend, the schoolteacher Mrs. Fletcher, "It must be young Timothy Carmichael. Ever since he lost that scholarship, his temper has been volatile." Mrs. Fletcher shook her head. "No, dear. Timothy's passions run hot for the headmaster's daughter, not for macabre clockwork." At the refreshment table, Colonel Melville leaned close to Reverend Clement, voice low. "I suspect Lady Carmichael's millinery rival, Madame Violetta, from the next county. She was seen inquiring about hat trunk designs last week." The vicar fidgeted with his collar. "Scandalous, Colonel, but would she know how to rig a ticking mechanism?" Meanwhile, beneath the shade of the lime tree, young Claire West, Raymond's niece, exclaimed to her cousin, "Perhaps there's a message from the poet in the old mill. He writes riddles, don't you know?" Raymond, mortified, pressed a hand to her arm. "Claire, darling, let's not weave fairy tales." Amid these murmurs, Miss Marple remained serenely still, though every name and nuance registered in her mind. Eventually, the maypole dance concluded with polite applause, and villagers drifted back toward the stalls, some to purchase jam, others to avoid the conversation entirely. Miss Marple rose and patted her knitting back into its small reticule. "Raymond, Lucy, shall we pay a call to Lady Carmichael? Her hats and her demeanor may reveal more than gossip." Raymond tucked away his notebook. An excellent idea. Lucy nodded, straightening her gloves. Together they approached the millinery tent, its striped canvas flapping softly in the breeze. Inside, Lady Carmichael fussed over the remains of her display table, rearranging the hats with precise, anxious care. As the trio entered, she looked up, lips pressed into a thin line. "Miss Marple," she greeted with measured politeness. "I trust you have heard nothing further of that disturbance." Miss Marple offered a gentle smile, only enough to prompt curiosity. "I wonder whether you might have observed anything unusual among your stock or among your visitors." Lady Carmichael's eyebrows lifted. "Visitors?" "I allowed any lady who wished to try on my hats. A few borrowed a box for adjustments, but none stayed long enough for mechanical tinkering." She gestured at the empty box frame. "I assure you I saw nothing amiss." Raymond leaned forward. "Your box was unique, battered, leather-bound. How did you come by it?" Lady Carmichael paused, selecting a dark cloche from shelf. "That belonged to my late grandmother. A curious piece. She used it for theatrical props in her youth. I keep it for sentiment." She traced the brass studs with a pale finger. "I should think none would tamper with an heirloom so precious." Miss Marple watched Lady Carmichael's fingers linger over the metal. An heirloom indeed, one familiar enough that its absence or disturbance might go unnoticed until too late. She tapped her reticule. "May I ask, have you had any visitors in the last fortnight who admire the Hatbox?" Lady Carmichael pursed her lips, as though recalling. "Well, Mrs. Petherick did admire it at a luncheon last week. She asked if I might lend it for her garden's annual fête, but I declined." She shook her head. "She respects my work, but has her own taste in garden party finery." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Thank you. And have you ever parted with the box for any other reason? For repairs, perhaps?" The milliner considered. "I sent it to a craftsman in Ludlow. He repaired the handle. That was 2 months ago." She glanced at a clock on the tent post. "But after that, it remained here." Miss Marple nodded. "Very well. I shall speak with the craftsman soon." She turned to Lucy. "Miss Pargeter, might you accompany me to the jam stall? I wish to inquire after Mrs. Blackwood's gossip, and assess whether her talent for preserves extends to mischief." Lucy hesitated, but offered an eager smile. "Certainly." She rose and led the way. Miss Marple watched them leave, then addressed Raymond quietly. "The box's provenance takes us to Ludlow, and perhaps the craftsman who mended the handle had access to its interior. Meanwhile, gossip attributes suspicion everywhere, from schoolboys to rival milliners, each a distraction from the true culprit." Raymond exhaled softly. "I'll contact Ludlow's workshop at once." Miss Marple patted his arm. "Excellent. Meanwhile, I shall listen for the gossip you trust least. Often, the loudest whispers conceal the faintest truths." As the village fete carried on beneath a brightening sky, the ticking Hatbox remained a silent promise of peril, its mystery knitting the villagers into a tapestry of suspicion. And in every sideways glance and half-spoken theory, Miss Marple discerned the first threads of a deeper design, one she would unravel long before high noon's final toll. Chapter 3. A Taste of Deception. The sun climbed higher over St. Mary Mead as Miss Marple and Mrs. Lucy Parger made their way toward Mrs. Blackwood's jam stall, where 3 long tables gleamed beneath striped awnings. Jars of gooseberry, cherry, and damson shimmered in the morning light, each adorned with crisply handwritten labels. A small sign read, "Taste freely, beware the red label," and a bench nearby invited visitors to sample Mrs. Blackwood's renowned preserves. Mrs. Blackwood, a stout woman in workmanlike attire with a generous smile, greeted them warmly. She offered 2 silver teaspoons. "Go right ahead, ladies. My red currant is especially tart this season." Lucy dipped the spoon into a jar, then tasted. Her eyes widened. Delicious! Just the right balance of sweet and sharp. Miss Marple's gaze drifted over the table. "Your labels are immaculate, Mary. Not a smudge on any of them." Mrs. Blackwood's smile faltered. "I take pride in my presentation, but there has been some gossip about that red label." She indicated the jar marked black currant with ginger, Some say the coloring came from a new dye, not natural coloring. Miss Marple inclined her head, a curious suggestion. Do you know who first mentioned it? Mrs. Blackwood lowered her voice. That was Mrs. Fletcher, the schoolteacher. She prided herself on detecting adulteration in her preserves. She glanced toward Mrs. Fletcher, who stood beside a tray of scones, her eyes bright behind pince-nez. She claimed it tasted off. Miss Marple tasted a spoonful herself, then set the spoon aside. I taste only ginger and blackcurrant. No hint of anything artificial. She studied Mrs. Fletcher with gentle interest. May I ask, Dorothy, what prompted your comment? Mrs. Fletcher stepped forward, smoothing her apron. Dear Jane, it was the slightest metallic tang. I thought at first it was my imagination, until I compared it with Mrs. Blackwood's raspberry. She indicated a neighboring jar. Then the difference was unmistakable. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Thank you. Your palate is keen. Yet the jar marked raspberry shows no such tang. Raymond West approached, having returned from a brisk walk to Ludlow's workshop. He carried a small leather satchel. A quick inquiry, he reported. The craftsman, Mr. Rollins, remembers repairing Lady Carmichael's hatbox. He confirms the interior was empty, no hidden mechanism, when he returned it last month, but he noted a fresh scratch on the lid's underside. Miss Marple's eyes lit. A scratch unseen at Ludlow, then inflicted sometime after its return here. She looked back to Mrs. Blackwood's stall. Thank you, Raymond. That places a hatbox in St. Mary Mead before the fete, giving our saboteur ample time. Mrs. Blackwood's lips trembled. Good heavens! Someone handled it after I returned it from repair. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to Colonel Melville, who stood erect by the scones, sampling one with martial precision. Colonel, you seem most interested in the ticking incident. Have you any insight? The colonel polished his mustache thoughtfully. Indeed, I feel a military discipline was at work. The ticking resembled a timing device on early wristwatches, used in field operations. My experience suggests the mechanism was adapted from a naval fuse. He tapped his cane. But why bring it here? To me, it was practice in psychological warfare. Miss Marple nodded. An intriguing theory. Thank you. Lucy Pargeter cleared her throat. I overheard Lady Carmichael mention sending the box to Ludlow. I did not know it passed through others. Perhaps one more person saw fit to test its contents. Miss Marple tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. So we have a sequence. Repair in Ludlow, return to Lady Carmichael, and handling thereafter by an unknown. The scratch on the lid suggests opportunistic interference. She paused, eyes narrowing, and the scratching tool, sharp, precise, implies patience and access. Someone in this fate. Mrs. Blackwood brightened. Perhaps the housekeeper at the vicarage. She cleans Lady Carmichael's stall weekly. Miss Marple considered. A possibility. But she holds no grudge against Lady Carmichael, at least none known. She turned to Mrs. Fletcher. Dorothy, you claimed adulteration. Yet your samples of jam are often correct, except for today. Could your objection have been a pretext to draw attention here? Mrs. Fletcher's face reddened. Surely you do not suggest I would sabotage Mrs. Blackwood's preserves? Miss Marple's smile was gentle. Not at all. But we must explore all paths, including those least expected. Raymond interjected. I've noted several villagers drift away from the stalls, perhaps to confer in private. Miss Marple's gaze swept the crowd. Mrs. Petherick speaking in hurried tones with Madame Violetta at the flower stall, Reverend Clement gesturing toward the refreshment tent as if to make a confidential point. Even Lucy's husband, Mr. Pargeter, slipping behind a linen canopy. A clandestine meeting, Miss Marple murmured. We shall attend those next. But first, she returned to the jam stall. She selected a jar of damson and held it aloft. Mary, tell me about this one. Mrs. Blackwood's smile returned, though edged with unease. Ah, damson, my grandmother's recipe. No dyes there, only sugar and fruit. Miss Marple nodded. I trust your truthfulness, Mary. Yet the red label warning. Was that your idea? Mrs. Blackwood hesitated, then nodded. I wanted to keep children from staining their clothes. I did not anticipate it drawing suspicion. Miss Marple inclined her head. An admirable precaution. She tapped the lid. One final question. Did anyone request a sample in an odd manner? Mrs. Blackwood pursed her lips. Now that you mention it, a gentleman in a tweed jacket asked for a private tasting, away from prying eyes. He seemed overly particular about the red label. Miss Marple's eyes glinted. Tweed, you say? She turned to Raymond. Does that connect any of our guests? Raymond thought. Mr. Havisham, the retired archivist, arrived in his customary tweed this morning. He browsed the jam before the Hatbox appeared. Miss Marple folded her hands. Then we shall speak with Mr. Havisham. But be discreet. Let us not alarm the fate further. Lucy, overhearing, added, I will fetch coffee from the refreshment tent. I can question Colonel Melville or Reverend Clement on their private conference. Miss Marple nodded. Thank you, Lucy. Raymond, and I will find Mr. Havisham. As Lucy departed, Miss Marple pocketed her knitting and looked once more at the jars. A stool stood nearby, its legs marred by small scrapes, similar to the scratch described by Mr. Rollins. She crouched, examining the leg. The wood grain held a fresh gouge, as though something heavy had been dragged across it. She stood and touched Raymond's arm. Notice this. Someone leaned against Mrs. Blackwood's stall after repairing the Hatbox, leaving the imprint of their deed. Raymond knelt to inspect. The scratch matches a lid scratch. Miss Marple smiled ever so slightly. A subtle confirmation. Our saboteur tested the box here, then left to place the ticking mechanism later. We have narrowed our window. Raymond rose. Then to Mr. Havisham. Miss Marple nodded. And remember, Raymond, the greatest deception often wears the most innocuous guise. Together, they wove through the crowd toward the archives of rumor and reputation, confident that each careful step brought them closer to the truth hidden beneath ribbons, jam, and ticking hearts. Chapter 4. Shadows in the Archive. Miss Marple and Raymond West slipped away from the jam stall and made their way across the village green toward the old vicarage library, where the retired archivist Mr. Algernon Havisham had taken residence. The bright flags of fate fluttered behind them, but here, ivy-clad windows and quiet dignity restored a different mood, one more conducive to reflection than revelry. They found Mr. Havisham in his favorite armchair beside a tall bookcase, gently turning the pages of a leather-bound volume. His tweed suit, complete with matching waistcoat, bespoke a man who measured life in centuries rather than hours. He looked up, adjusting his spectacles. Miss Marple, Mr. West, do come in, he greeted, voice smooth as vellum. I trust the fate has entertained you. Miss Marple inclined her head, charming, until an unfortunate interruption. She allowed her gaze to drift over the rows of carefully labeled tomes. We wish to ask you about your interest in Mrs. Blackwood's jam stall this morning. Havisham set the book aside, steepling his fingers. Ah, yes, such extraordinary preserves. I was curious if any rare varietals were included in her red label. A scholar's palate, you understand. Raymond stepped forward. You requested a private tasting, we're told. Provided a Hatbox scratch in your tweed, we wondered if you... Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on his arm. We wonder if you observed any tampering with the Hatbox itself when it sat at Lady Carmichael's stall. Mr. Havisham's brow lifted. Tampering? My dear, I touched the box only to examine its craftsmanship. My interest was purely antiquarian. The brass studs, the stitch work, all of it fascinated me. He waved a slender hand, but I saw nothing within that brim. Miss Marple's eyes glinted with quiet approval. Thank you. And you noted no scratch on the lid's underside? Havisham shook his head. None at the time. If a scratch appeared later, it must have been after I left. He leaned back, gaze drifting to the dusty volumes. Might I offer you tea? The Fates' refreshments pale in comparison to a proper Victorian blend. Raymond glanced at his notebook. Perhaps later. One more question. Did you hear the ticking from the Hatbox? Havisham's lips curved in a faint smile. I did not. Arrived shortly after the incident. Its only function to me was decorative. Miss Marple rose. Thank you, Algernon. Your testimony is invaluable. They left Mr. Haversham's study, stepping into the cool corridor. As Miss Marple closed the door, Raymond exhaled. He's innocent, but his interest in the red label suggests he may have seen more than he let on. Miss Marple nodded. Indeed, but innocence can wear two faces. Now, let us visit Colonel Melville and Reverend Clement at the refreshment tent. They appeared deep in conversation this morning. The refreshment tent stood between the cake stall and the maypole, its canvas walls billowing slightly in the breeze. Colonel Melville, still in uniform jacket, though his medals were unsheathed, spoke in low tones to Reverend Clement, who clutched a tray of sponge cakes with a distracted air. Miss Marple approached, knitting reticule in hand. Colonel, Reverend, may we intrude? The colonel straightened. By all means, Miss Marple. Reverend Clement offered a nervy smile. Miss Marple gestured toward the cakes. Thank you, but I wished only to inquire about your private discussion earlier. Reverend Clement's eyes darted to Colonel Melville. The colonel cleared his throat. Ah, yes. We were debating the scheduling of bells for high noon. The Reverend argued a later toll to accommodate our festivities. Miss Marple's gaze softened. A practical matter. Yet I noted you watched the Hatbox's removal with peculiar intensity. Did you suspect more than a prank? The colonel's stern facade slipped. I suspected the timing implied preparation for something that would fall precisely at high noon. A man trained in discipline discerns the telltale signs. He tapped his cane. If one manipulates timing, one manipulates fear. Reverend Clement cleared his throat. Colonel believed Lady Carmichael's box might contain a fuse set to ignite a firework display, an assassination attempt. He blinked apologetically at Miss Marple. It was a fearful thought. Miss Marple inclined her head. Fear can blur the line between imagination and evidence. Did you see anyone near the box in the moments before the ticking began? The colonel exhaled. A gentleman in a bowler hat lingered close, examining the underside. I cannot place him among the villagers. Perhaps a stranger. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. A stranger in bowler, distinct from the tweed we first noted. She made a mental note. Thank you both. Your vigilance is appreciated. Emerging back onto the green, Miss Marple and Raymond paused beneath the fluttering bunting. The Fates' music drifted on the air. Fiddles, whistles, a tentative jig, attempts to restore its spirit. But beneath the surface, currents of suspicion continued to swirl. It seems our suspect list includes a bowler-hatted stranger, Raymond observed, and still no sign of him. Miss Marple folded her arms. Yet the bowler's fleeting presence near the box, and the scratch matching the stall's leg, points to someone agile and discreet. The stranger may have left as quickly as he arrived. Raymond frowned. And Lady Carmichael's box was on display near the jam stall. Did the stranger move between stalls? Miss Marple's lips curved in a thoughtful smile. Perhaps. Or perhaps he lingered behind the refreshment tent, emerging only at the moment of ticking. In any case, we must consider one more location. The millinery workshop behind Lady Carmichael's tent. If the stranger was skilled enough to rig a ticking mechanism, he may have returned there afterward. Raymond straightened. I will secure a passage through the back gate. Miss Marple nodded. And I will speak with Lady Carmichael, secure her consent. As they parted ways, the fate continued its dance of gaiety and unease. Somewhere in its midst lurked a stranger and a ticking promise of peril. And Miss Marple, ever patient, gathered her clues like petals from the maypole ribbons, preparing for the moment when all threads would converge, and the true culprit stand revealed. Chapter 5. Secrets Behind the Veil. Late afternoon found Miss Marple and Raymond West standing before the narrow door at the rear of Lady Carmichael's millinery tent. The sun slanted low, gilding the striped canvas in warm light, while the Fates' music drifted faintly. Merriment edged with tension. Lady Carmichael herself, clad in a high-collared blouse and skirt of dove-gray silk, awaited them with composed politeness. "Thank you for agreeing," she said quietly as she lifted the latch. "The workshop beyond is small, but you are welcome to inspect it fully." Miss Marple inclined her head. "I am most grateful. Every detail, may shed light upon that troubling hatbox. Inside, the cramped space smelled of starch and lavender. Mannequin heads with half-finished bonnets lined one wall. A sewing machine hummed idly beneath a patchwork of fabrics. On a narrow workbench lay scattered tools: scissors, awls, a small hammer, alongside scraps of ribbon and hat block patterns pinned to corkboard. Raymond ran a finger over the edge of the workbench. "I see no obvious mechanism here," he observed, tracing the grain of the pine. "Yet someone capable might bring in the ticking device later." Miss Marple drifted along the shelves, noting each label and object. She paused before a low cabinet, its drawer slightly ajar. Inside lay lengths of wire, a coil of thin leather strap, and a small metal cog, components more apt for clockwork than millinery. She lifted the cog gingerly. Lady Carmichael's brows flickered. "Those belong to my brother, Siegfried. He was an amateur clockmaker until he departed for Liverpool last year. He left his tools here." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "Clockwork. Just what we need. May I examine the cog more closely?" Lady Carmichael stepped aside. "Of course." Miss Marple turned the cog in her glove hand. Its teeth fine, cut with precision. A matching gear must drive the ticking mechanism. Raymond bent to peer. "Look here. This cog bears a tiny gouge, as though it meshed poorly with another gear." He balanced on the workbench. "If our saboteur used these parts, they improvised with what was at hand." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, and the gouge suggests hurried assembly, perhaps in another location. Yet the cog itself belongs to Siegfried Carmichael." Lady Carmichael's expression tightened. "My brother was never involved in such theatrics. He loved puzzles, yes, but nothing more." She crossed her arms. "When he left, he warned me to guard his workshop carefully." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "He knew you valued his tools. But someone with access, perhaps you lent him or he lent someone else, that key to your workshop." Lady Carmichael shook her head. "Only I hold the key." She produced a small brass key from her pocket. "I keep it on this chain." Miss Marple studied the key. A simple design, easily duplicated, but only if one examined it closely. She glanced at the drawer where the cog lay. "Did anyone else come here this afternoon?" Lady Carmichael considered. "My apprentice, Miss Eliza Stokes, fetched materials for the display. She handles fabrics quickly, but she knows nothing of clockwork." Raymond tapped his chin. "But she carries the key on a ribbon around her waist, does she not?" Lady Carmichael nodded. "She keeps it close at hand. She manages the fittings." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Then we must speak with Miss Stokes. But first, I wish to examine the floor beneath this workbench." She knelt and swept aside a small pile of fabric scraps, revealing narrow cracks between the boards. With a gentle prod, she lifted a loose plank. Beneath lay a shallow void containing a bundle of wire, a length of fused cord, and a small leather pouch embroidered with a skull motif. She retrieved the pouch and untied its drawstring. Inside lay a tiny spring-loaded mechanism, its face etched with numerals. Lady Carmichael gasped. "My goodness, that belongs on a pocket watch." Miss Marple held the device aloft. "Indeed, a miniaturized timekeeper, repurposed here as a ticking device." She turned to Raymond. "We now know the makeshift mechanism was assembled in this room, where these parts lay ready." Raymond's notebook appeared. "We should photograph these components for the magistrate." Miss Marple tucked the pouch into her reticule. "Yes, but let us next speak with Miss Stokes, to learn who else accessed this workshop." Under the awning's flickering lanterns, Miss Eliza Stokes stood by the tent's flap, smoothing her pinafore. She was a young woman of 18 or 19, her brown hair gathered in a practical knot. She lifted an anxious smile as Miss Marple and Raymond approached. "Miss Marple, Mr. West," she greeted softly. I heard you wished to ask about the workshop." Miss Marple offered the smallest reassurance. "Only to learn who else entered after you fetched the materials this morning." Eliza's brow furrowed. "No one. I came for silk and hat wire, then left. Later I saw someone slip inside, wearing a bowler hat, though I could not see their face." Her lips trembled. "I thought it odd, but assumed someone borrowed a tool." Raymond leaned forward. "A bowler hat! like the stranger Colonel Melville mentioned. Eliza nodded. Yes. He moved quietly, paused by the cabinet, then left as swiftly as he came. It was after lunch, when I returned to tidy up. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Did you hear any sound? Whispers, breathing, the kind of ticking we heard earlier? Eliza's eyes flickered. I thought I heard a faint click, but I cannot be certain. I excused myself because I was uneasy. Miss Marple patted her hand. You did well to report this now. Your description confirms our bowler-hatted stranger moved between stalls and workshop. His presence links both scenes. Eliza swallowed. I am sorry I waited so long. Miss Marple rose. Fear can stiffen one's tongue. Thank you, Eliza. She turned to Lady Carmichael. Your apprentice's testimony confirms what I suspected. Our saboteur knows your tools, your space, and moves with furtive skill. Lady Carmichael pressed her gloved hand to her heart. But who? I cannot imagine Eliza would lie. Miss Marple's eyes glinted with thoughtful calm. No, my dear. The truth lies not in fabrication, but in omission. Someone withheld what they saw until now. As the three reconvened beside the jam stall, Miss Marple held the cog and the spring-loaded mechanism carefully. Raymond glanced at his notebook. We have the cog from Siegfried set, the miniature timepiece mechanism, and the apprentice's sighting of the stranger, he summarized. Miss Marple nodded. And Lady Carmichael's key, easily observed, easily duplicated. She folded her knitting. Yet motive remains elusive. Why choose this method, a ticking Hatbox, to threaten our peaceful fate? Raymond considered. To draw attention to the Hatbox's origin, to implicate Lady Carmichael or her family. Miss Marple's glance turned inward, and to test reactions. Each interruption taught the saboteur, who cared enough to notice. Now we know our stranger, bowler, familiar with clockwork, comfortable in the workshop, likely moved on. She looked toward the festival center, villagers dancing, unaware of the hidden hand that toyed with their nerves. We have the mechanism and the movement. Next, we must find where the bowler-hatted man resides, or whom he visited after the workshop. Raymond tapped his pen against his notebook. I can circulate a discreet inquiry among the visiting guests. Miss Marple smiled with gentle decisiveness. Do so, Raymond. Meanwhile, I shall examine Siegfried Carmichael's letters. Perhaps he mentioned lending tools to a friend. As the maypole dancers wound their ribbons under the brightening lanterns, Miss Marple gathered her clues, cogs, springs, and half-spoken confidences, knowing that only by weaving them together would the stranger's identity emerge in the shadows behind the millinery veil. Chapter 6. The Archive at Carmichael House. As twilight softened the edges of St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple and Raymond West bade farewell to the fate for a moment, slipping to flower-fragrant lanes toward Lady Carmichael's residence. The millinery tent, lively by day, lay quiet now, its tools stowed away, mannequins draped in half-finished hats. Beyond, Carmichael House stood serenely, its bay windows aglow with lamplight. Lady Carmichael greeted them at the door with an air of composed hospitality, ushering them into a cozy sitting room lined with dark wood and tufted settees. A low fire crackled in the hearth, and the scent of bergamot drifted from a silver teapot. On an adjacent desk lay an open portfolio of letters and invoices. Siegfried Carmichael's correspondence, as promised. I hope you don't mind, Lady Carmichael said softly, pouring tea for her guests. My brother's letters are personal, but they may contain the answer you seek. Miss Marple inclined her head. Thank you, my dear. Every scrap of context helps. She accepted a cup, noting the fine china's delicate rose pattern. Raymond settled beside the desk, adjusting his pen. Lady Carmichael closed the door and stood behind Miss Marple. He wrote to me frequently from Liverpool, she explained. A handful of letters arrived here fortnightly. I kept them for posterity. Miss Marple dipped her spoon into the tea, eyeing the desk's contents. She picked up the topmost envelope, its postmark faded but legible. Liverpool, June 3rd. The handwriting was unmistakably Siegfried's precise script. She opened and unfolded the letter. Dearest Beatrice, Tomorrow's demonstration at St. Mary Mead should prove exhilarating. I have enclosed a small brass cog and spring. Do take care of them until my return. The device may startle the assembly, but they must learn to anticipate change. I trust you will keep it out of curious hands. Yours, always, S.C. Miss Marple laid the letter aside, brow knitting. A demonstration is a telling word. He entrusted these parts to you, yet feared curious hands. Who, do you think, might have gained access? Lady Carmichael bit her lip. Only my apprentice, Eliza. She fetched materials but never saw my private letters. Raymond rifled through the next envelope, dated June 10th. Beatrice. I overheard Colonel Melville speak of timing devices in his last letter. He seemed fascinated by naval engineering. You might show him the workshop under the guise of curiosity. Then keep the parts safe. Let discretion be your ally. S. Miss Marple's eyes glinted as she set down the letter. Colonel Melville, she murmured. He admired the mechanism. Yet why would Siegfried suggest you cloak your actions under guise of curiosity? A prudent precaution, or perhaps a subtle warning. Lady Carmichael's gaze fell. My brother distrusted the colonel's interest. He warned me that military men sometimes value spectacle above safety. Miss Marple rose and stepped to the desk's lamp, cradling her teacup. She peered at the dated envelopes. Only 3 letters, early May, early June, and mid-June. No letter directly preceded yesterday's incident, yet the second mentions Melville's naval fuses. Raymond, she said, note the date, June 10th. 2 days ago, the fate arrangements were finalized. Someone may have matched your demonstration to Mrs. Petherick's celebration. Raymond scribbled. He still trusted Lieutenant Melville with the parts. Miss Marple replaced the envelope and looked to Lady Carmichael. Please, show us your workshop key. The milliner produced a small brass key on its ribbon. Miss Marple examined it thoughtfully. Not difficult to duplicate at Ludlow, but you never left it unattended, except when Miss Stokes carried it. Beatrice Carmichael nodded. Yes, Eliza always wore it at her waist. Miss Marple turned to Raymond. Let us next confirm whether Eliza ever encountered Colonel Melville or received a message during the fete. Lady Carmichael led them to the hallway, where a mounted telephone awaited by the newel post. If you wish, I can ring Miss Stokes at her lodgings. Miss Marple inclined her head, a wise precaution. Meanwhile, I shall share these letters with Mrs. Petherick. She may recall overhearing something. Raymond raised an eyebrow. Mrs. Petherick at this hour? Lady Carmichael smiled faintly. She and the colonel are colleagues on the horticultural committee. They host occasional meetings here. Miss Marple turned to leave, wrapping her reticule about her arm. Then we shall find both, and perhaps discover if the colonel's fascination became more than scholarly curiosity. The night air was cool against their faces as they retraced their steps toward the Petherick's vicarage annex, where the horticultural committee had gathered under lantern light. The colonel and Mrs. Petherick, seated at a polished mahogany table strewn with seed catalogs and floral diagrams, looked up in surprise at the trio's arrival. Miss Marple, Raymond, what brings you here? Mrs. Petherick asked, brushing soil from her gloves. Miss Marple inclined her head. Your hospitality, dear Clara. We wish to run a few matters past committee, particularly regarding the colonel's interest in our recent incident. Colonel Melville rose, voice measured. I trust this does not concern my botanical advice. Miss Marple smiled. On the contrary, your remarks on timing devices caught my attention. Did you discuss naval fuses with Mrs. Petherick earlier, or privately with Siegfried's letters? She waved the June 10th letter. Perhaps both. Mrs. Petherick cleared her throat. The colonel and I did discuss spectacle. They ponder fireworks for next year's fete. The colonel dipped his chin. Only fireworks, I assure you. Naval fuses bear little resemblance to garden pyrotechnics. Miss Marple turned to Mrs. Petherick. Did you hear any mention of demonstration or parts yesterday? Mrs. Petherick hesitated. I recall the colonel showing me a small brass cog. He admired its craftsmanship. He said he wondered where it came from. She glanced at Melville. But we spoke of soil aerators, not spectacles. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the colonel, who maintained an impassive posture. "And private consultations with Miss Stokes. Did you see her at the workshop after the fete closed?" Mrs. Petherick's lips compressed. "Only briefly. She collected the key I had borrowed to examine headpieces." Miss Marple addressed Raymond. "We must question Miss Stokes directly, and then review Siegfried's ledger for any other recipients of his parts. But the weight of evidence suggests Colonel Melville may have sought the components for his own demonstration, one more startling than fireworks." The colonel's eyes flickered. He pressed a hand to the table. "Miss Marple, I assure you, my interest was purely academic." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Indeed, academic interest can be as compelling a motive as any other." She collected her knitting and rose. "Thank you all for your candor. Raymond and I will continue our inquiries with Miss Stokes, and then cross-reference Siegfried's ledger." As they departed into the night, Miss Marple paused beneath a climbing rose. She fingered the letters in her reticule. "Raymond, piece together the ledger's entries against our correspondence. Tomorrow at dawn, we shall confront our colonel once more, armed with figures he cannot dismiss." Raymond smiled. "Onward, and Jane." Miss Marple's silhouette receded into the garden's lantern light, her mind weaving tomorrow's tapestry of clues, and moving ever closer to the moment when a hidden motive would stand bare beneath high noon's unblinking glare. Chapter 7. Confessions in the Ledger Room. Dawn's pale light crept over St. Mary Mead as Miss Marple and Raymond West arrived at Miss Eliza Stokes's lodgings, a tidy cottage tucked behind a millinery tent. The lane was hushed save for the distant hum of the village waking. Eliza, in a simple morning dress and shawl, opened the door with a nervous smile. "Miss Marple, Mr. West, thank you for coming," she whispered, ushering them inside. The room was small but orderly. A writing desk beneath a curtained window, a single bed neatly made, and a wardrobe whose door bore a brass hook. A faint scent of lavender lingered in the air. Miss Marple closed the door gently. "Eliza, you told us of the bowler-hatted stranger entering the workshop. I wonder now, did you notice him carrying anything?" Eliza's eyes darted to the desk. "I did not see a package, but his right hand clutched something small, perhaps a pouch. He moved with purpose, but I could not discern the object." Raymond stepped forward. "And you said you fetched the key for Lady Carmichael. You unlocked the workshop yourself. Did you lock it again afterward?" Eliza nodded. "Yes, always. Yet when I returned after the ticking incident, the door was slightly ajar. I thought I had forgotten to latch it." She pressed her hand to her heart. "I blamed myself. I feared I had invited trouble." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Your concern is understandable, but your diligence in reporting now is far more valuable." She produced a leather-bound ledger Siegfried had kept, the one Lady Carmichael lent them. Eliza's eyes widened as she recognized her employer's neat entries. Raymond opened the ledger to entries beginning in April. Each line listed dates, parts dispatched, and recipients. April 12th, 1 brass cog, Liverpool workshop. May 3rd, 1 spring mechanism, Beatrice Carmichael. May 15th, 2 lengths fuse cord, Colonel Melville. June 3rd, 1 cog, 1 spring, Beatrice Carmichael. June 10th, 1 cog, Colonel Melville. June 19th, 1 fuse assembly. Miss Marple's finger traced the last, incomplete entry dated June 19th, the day before the fete. No recipient was noted, only the hastily scrawled fuse assembly and a question mark. Raymond peered over her shoulder. So Siegfried sent Colonel Melville 2 cogs, 1 for testing, 1 for record. Yet on June 19th, he reports a completed assembly, but omits the recipient. Eliza gasped. "My goodness!" He knew someone would receive it, but he erased the name. Miss Marple nodded. He must have sensed the parts were leaving proper channels, perhaps taken without his instruction. She closed the ledger. "Eliza, did you see anyone take parts from the workshop on the eve of the fete?" Eliza bit her lip. "Late last night, I heard voices. I peered through the keyhole and saw Colonel Melville and Reverend Clement whispering by the cabinet. They retrieved something wrapped in cloth and slipped away." Raymond's pen stilled. "They both, he and the vicar?" Eliza shivered. Yes. They argued softly I could not hear, but one of them said, "We must ensure it ticks at the proper moment." Then they left. Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Raymond. "This is crucial, Eliza. You must tell me how long you watched." Eliza pressed her lips together. "Only a minute. Then I thought it best not to intervene." Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt. "You did well to tell us now. Your observation fills the ledger's blank. Our fuse assembly went to Secretary Clement." Raymond whispered, "which explains the vicar's vague involvement." Miss Marple clutched her reticule. "Indeed. Now, we must confront Colonel Melville and Reverend Clement together, armed with these entries." She turned to Eliza. "Thank you, dear. You've been most brave. Please remain here. Raymond and I will return shortly." The vicarage stood silent save for the slow toll of the church clock as Miss Marple and Raymond crossed the dew-damp lawn to the vicar's study. Through the window, they saw Reverend Clement arranging prayer books and the rector's seal upon the desk. Miss Marple rapped lightly. The door opened to admit them both. Clement stood, his calm veneer fraught as he noted the ledger in Miss Marple's hand. "Reverend," she began, "we have reason to believe you received a fused assembly from Siegfried Carmichael, one meant to produce a ticking device." She placed the ledger before him. "Open to the June 19th line. Care to explain?" Clement's face paled. He cleared his throat. I took the device only to examine its workings. As a man of learning, I was curious." Raymond stepped forward, curious enough to conspire with Colonel Melville and orchestrate a threat. Clement shook his head. "We meant no harm. Colonel wished to create a harmless demonstration, an automaton for next year's fate. The ticking was a test." Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "A test that frightened Mrs. Petherick and your congregation alike. You used the fate as unwitting host." Clement swallowed. It spun out of control. "I never intended to frighten anyone, and I did not know he would forge a threat note." Miss Marple turned to the empty chair where Colonel Melville should have sat today. "Speaking of intentions, where is your collaborator?" Clement's eyes darted. He left to fetch tea." At that moment, Colonel Melville entered, bearing a silver tray with 2 cups and a pot. His uniform was immaculate, but his usual poise wavered at the ledger's sight. "Miss Marple," he said, setting the tray down, "I trust we may discuss this amicably." Miss Marple gestured to the ledger. "Colonel, you received parts intended for confusion, not celebration. You conspired with the vicar to adapt them, yet neglected to consider the human cost." Melville's voice was measured. "My concern was spectacle and astonishment, nothing more." Raymond folded his arms. "Spectacle that nearly ruined the fate. And you lied about the scratch on the cog." The colonel's jaw tightened. "That scratch occurred during testing at my quarters, when the mechanism jammed. I noted it, but thought it inconsequential." Miss Marple's eyes glinted. "Yet you did not record it in Siegfried's ledger. Instead, you left the entry ambiguous, questioning to whom it was sent." The colonel's gaze flickered to Reverend Clement. We hoped the ambiguity would conceal our involvement." Clement bowed his head. "A grave error." Miss Marple folded her knitting. "Indeed, your error was thinking a ticking device, once silenced, would go unnoticed, but the villagers remember sound more keenly than sight." She rose. "I shall inform Mrs. Petherick and Lady Carmichael. Meanwhile, you two remain here to answer for your folly." As they departed, the colonel and the vicar exchanged a glance edged with remorse. The ledger lay open between them, its blank question mark now filled by Eliza's testimony, and by a confession that will restore peace only when the story reached its final chapter. Outside, Miss Marple inhaled the crisp morning air. "Raymond," she said softly, "the pieces fall into place. But our final step must be the test of subtle psychology. One more conversation before high noon." Raymond nodded. "Then let us prepare." Miss Marple's silhouette lingered by the window, mind already weaving concluding threads of a tapestry fashioned from ink and intention, ready to reveal the heart of human nature in the precise manner she alone could accomplish. Chapter 8. A Tentative Demonstration. Late morning brought a stiff breeze to St. Mary Mead, skirting the edges of the fake grounds with a crisp warning. Miss Marple arrived at Mrs. Petherick's marquee, a newly erected pavilion reserved for demonstrations and announcements, and surveyed the small assembly she had summoned. Colonel Melville, Reverend Clement, Lady Carmichael, Mrs. Blackwood, and Raymond West. Each bore an expression of polite curiosity tinged with unease. Miss Marple smiled her gentle welcome. "Thank you all for attending on such short notice. I promise a small demonstration of our now infamous mechanism, an opportunity to test our theories before high noon." Lady Carmichael laid a hand on her embroidered reticule. "I confess some trepidation, Jane, but I trust your judgment." Mrs. Blackwood nodded, fingers clasped. "As do I." Colonel Melville stood slightly apart, his uniform jacket buttoned with military precision, while Reverend Clement clasped his prayer book to his chest. Raymond held a small wooden box, the reconstructed Hatbox, its leather surface unmarred by brass studs, its lid closed. Miss Marple motioned to a bench. "Please be seated." When they had assembled on straight-backed chairs, she set the wooden box on a low table before them and tapped the lid lightly with her knitting needle. Raymond lifted the lid. Inside lay the original velvet bonnet, beneath which nestled a little pocket watch, and a small quartz dial Miss Marple had added to replace the crude parchment. She invited Colonel Melville to wind the watch gently. He obeyed, hands steady but eyes flickering as the tiny spring released its tension, sending the hands ticking at 1-second intervals. Miss Marple inclined her head. "Thank you, Colonel. Now, Reverend, might you attach the spring-loaded assembly into the bonnet, as you and the Colonel did 2 days past?" Reverend Clement's eyes widened. He took a slender leather pouch from his breast pocket, one he had thought discarded, and withdrew the miniature mechanism. Hands trembling, he fitted it around the watch before returning the bonnet to its place. Each motion bore the weight of yesterday's confessions. Miss Marple tapped the base of the box with her needle. "Very well. Now, shall we see whether the device performs as designed?" She closed the lid and nodded to Raymond, who adjusted the bonnet. So the watch face lay just beneath a small clerical skull motif carved into the wood. The 3 women exchanged worried glances. Colonel Melville's jaw tightened as he observed the arrangement. Miss Marple settled her knitting needles into her reticule and leaned forward, eyes bright with anticipation. At the count of 3, Raymond will wind the watch fully. When the ticking begins, I want each of you to remain perfectly still. Observe only the sound and your own reaction. Lady Carmichael drew a steadying breath. Mrs. Blackwood clutched her gloves. Colonel Melville squared his shoulders. Reverend Clement bowed his head ever so slightly. Raymond wound the watch. A soft click echoed as the lid sealed. Then, after a long, drawn-out pause, the ticking began, first faint, then growing in confidence. The dozen assembled parishioners and fete attendees beyond the pavilion paused in their milling, drawn by the unexpected pulse of the mechanism. Within the circle, Lady Carmichael's shoulders rose in a slight shudder. Mrs. Blackwood pressed a hand to her throat. Colonel Melville's eyes flicked sideways toward Reverend Clement, and the Reverend's lips parted in a silent gasp. Miss Marple sat perfectly still, knitting needles resting on her lap, eyes closed in feigned meditation. The ticking filled the silent marquee like a heartbeat. After 10 measured seconds, she opened her eyes. "Thank you all. It performs precisely as before." She tapped the wooden box. Yet notice how the watch's sound changed when moved from the workshop to this space. Acoustics, air currents, and emotional timbre all affect perception. She turned to Colonel Melville. "Colonel, did you observe anyone flinch more than was necessary?" He cleared his throat. "I confess I found it unsettling." His gaze flicked once more to Reverend Clement. I had hoped it would demonstrate only mechanical prowess. Miss Marple's lips curved. "Indeed. And you, Reverend? Any difference in how you perceive the ticking today?" Reverend Clement folded his prayer book. "It reminded me of my congregation's heartbeat." His voice trembled. "And I feared you intended harm." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Fear is the very currency of our mystery. But neither of you, nor Lady Carmichael or Mrs. Blackwood, flinched as I did." She drew out a slender piece of porcelain from her reticule and held it aloft. A tiny teacup saucer, cracked in the form of a jagged hourglass. I passed this fragment to each of you yesterday, she continued, voice softening. It originated from Mrs. Petherick's china, broken when you reacted most sharply to the ticking. She turned to Mrs. Petherick, who had quietly stepped into pavilion with a silver tray of fresh scones. Clara, whose reflex broke the saucer, Mrs. Petherick's eyes glistened. I startled when the ticking accelerated. I tried to set down the tray. In my shock, it slipped. She extended a trembling hand. Did you collect all the pieces? Miss Marple nodded, returning the shard to her muff. Yes, your startled motion bruised the china far more decisively than any other reaction here. She paced slowly around the table. The trick was not merely to threaten, but to provoke an overreaction in a particular individual. She paused behind Colonel Melville, voice lowering. Colonel, this was your plan, to test courage under pressure, then refine the spectacle. Colonel Melville's shoulders drooped. He turned slowly, face ashen. A demonstration on human nature, not machinery, he admitted. I wanted to see who would falter first. Miss Marple's gaze softened as she approached him, and the broken saucer confirmed the first falterer was Mrs. Petherick. She moved to Reverend Clement. You assisted him, Reverend, hoping your gentle authority would comfort her, but instead compounded her fear. Reverend Clement's hands fell to his sides. I only wish to preserve peace. Miss Marple raised a gentle finger. Peace born of fear is no peace at all, and our demonstration today confirms that the withered heart beats invisible startle, not silent control. She turned to the small audience beyond the pavilion. Gentle villagers, you have witnessed a lesson in human response. Fear, once sown, reveals more than calm deliberation ever could. A murmur of understanding rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Petherick wiped her eyes, breath shuddering. Lady Carmichael placed a comforting hand on her friend's arm. Mrs. Blackwood exhaled in relief. Miss Marple settled her knitting reticule and offered a gentle nod to Colonel Melville and Reverend Clement. Now, you may reflect upon the nature of your experiment. The fate may resume, with the assurance that no harm was intended. But let us remember, on high noon's toll, we measure time not by ticking alone, but by the courage to stand unshaken. As she closed the wooden box for the final time, the ticking ceased and the pavilion exhaled. The villagers dispersed with quiet conversations, the trait of unity tempered by insight, and Miss Marple, ever composed, prepared for the final moments when the true heart of human nature, revealed by fear's tremor, would stand exposed in the light of high noon. Chapter 9. The Silent Watchers. The fade had resumed its gentle hum by early afternoon. Children's laughter rippling across the green, the fiddlers coaxing a jaunty tune, and the taste of strawberry cream drifting from Mrs. Petherick's tent. Yet beneath the surface of renewed gaiety lay a quieter tension, a ring of watchful eyes tracking one another's movement, and a subtle undercurrent of doubt threading through polite conversation. Miss Marple stood beneath an ancient oak near the maypole, knitting reticule at her side, observing the villagers as though they were pieces on a chessboard. Raymond West hovered nearby, notebook in hand. The warm sun filtered through the leaves, dappling the lawn with shifting patches of light. Perfect camouflage for secrets lurking just out of sight. She beckoned Raymond to her side. Notice how Mrs. Blackwood lingers by her jam stall, yet tastes nothing. And Lady Carmichael continuously adjusts her brim, betraying anxiety. She paused as Mrs. Blackwood exchanged a quick glance with Lord Carmichael's footman, then smiled politely before stepping away. Raymond lowered his voice. Their reaction seemed rehearsed, too composed after our demonstration. Miss Marple's gaze drifted across the green. Indeed, and yet it is the silent watchers who reveal most. She pointed to a trio of elderly villagers seated on a bench. Mrs. Watkins, the school governor, Mr. Enniscorthy, the retired bank manager, and Miss Gladstone, the seamstress. They sat side by side, nodded their hands in their laps, and watched every movement with unblinking attention. Raymond, said Miss Marple, let us engage our silent trio. Their collective memory of village life may provide the context we lack. She led the way toward the bench, the three newcomers straightening as a detective and her nephew approached. Good afternoon, Miss Marple greeted, settling beside Mrs. Watkins. I wonder if you might indulge me a moment of your wisdom. Mrs. Watkins, a prim woman with white hair and spectacles perched at the bridge of her nose, inclined her head. Of course, Miss Marple. Miss Marple nodded to her companions. We have seen how our demonstration today revealed each person's reaction to fear. Now, I am curious. Have you observed any earlier moments today where someone's impulse struck you as unusual? Mr. Enniscorthy, neat in his tweed suit, adjusted his watch. Well, I did see Reverend Clement pacing by the flower border just before the demonstration, head bowed as though rehearsing a penance. Miss Marple smiled. She turned to Miss Gladstone. And you, dear? Miss Gladstone smoothed the hem of her skirt. I noticed Colonel Melville slip away from the pavilion to the far side of the maypole, where no one could see him. He spoke into his cuff, most unmilitary for him. Raymond's pen scratched across the page. A private call? Miss Marple inclined her head. Indeed, perhaps to coordinate with an accomplice, or to ensure the device functioned as expected. She rose, patting her reticule. Thank you all. Your observations are invaluable. A breath later, Miss Marple and Raymond drifted toward the far edge of the fete, where Maypole's ribbons fluttered in a lonely breeze. The colonel emerged from behind the pole, slipping the telephone receiver into his pocket. He nodded curtly to Miss Marple as she approached. "Colonel," she began softly, "might I hear what you said just now? You seemed intent." He stiffened, glancing around. Merely a call to Mrs. Blackwood, to ask that she replenish her jam stock. He forced a grin. The red-labeled jams vanished by midday. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, just a fraction. A pragmatic concern, certainly. Yet when I invited you to demonstrate the mechanism, your eagerness surpassed mere curiosity. His posture loosened. I admit my fascination runs deep. As a man of discipline, I marvel at a well-timed device, its precision, its power over emotion. She watched him in silence, then nodded. I understand. Thank you. You may return to your duties. As he strode away, Miss Marple turned to Raymond. That confirmation bolsters our understanding of motive, but does not complete the puzzle. She scanned the crowd, then paused as she spotted Reverend Clement, pausing at the edge of the rose border, his eyes fixed upon Lady Carmichael's tent. Clement held something small and dark in his hand, a leather pouch identical to the one Eliza had discovered. Raymond, noticing her gaze, followed it. He still carrying the mechanism's pouch? Miss Marple folded her knitting aside. He must believe he still needs to court guilt or protect a secret. She crossed the grass at a deliberate pace, Raymond at her heels. Clement turned as they approached, pocketing the pouch with an apologetic nod. "Reverend," Miss Marple said quietly, "you carry that pouch yet again. It holds nothing now, its spring wound down." Clement's eyes flickered. "I kept it as a reminder of my folly." Miss Marple's gaze was soft. "A paperweight of conscience, yet the weight grows heavier." She tapped her reticule. "We may no longer need it for evidence. Tomorrow I shall return it to Siegfried's ledger. Complete the record." Clement bowed his head. "Thank you." As they left Clement to his thoughts, Miss Marple paused near the refreshment tent, where Mrs. Blackwood sold scones and lemonade. The lady's smile flickered as Miss Marple approached. "Mary," she began, "I wonder if you might share what you saw when Colonel Melville called you just now." Mrs. Blackwood blushed. "He asked for more red currant, yes, but I suspected something in his tone." She leaned forward. He sounded triumphant, as though a test had succeeded. Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed, and that triumph is the final piece. It reveals his true intent." She turned to Raymond. "Let us gather our witnesses for the final reveal." An hour later, the villagers assembled once more in Mrs. Petherick's marquee. Mrs. Petherick summoned attention with a polite bell. Miss Marple stood beneath the gilt chandelier, knitting needles glinting in the lantern light. Raymond, at her side, held the now-restored Hatbox. "Ladies and gentlemen," Miss Marple began, "we have learned much in the past 2 days about fear, timing, and human nature. The demonstration uncovered reactions, the ledger revealed conspiracies, and the silent watchers confirmed private actions." She paused, allowing the hushed audience to settle. Yet one question remained. Who among us sought not merely to test, but to triumph? Who orchestrated these events as a showcase of power over emotion? She looked toward Colonel Melville, whose uniform stood rigid. Colonel, you admire the mechanism's precision, and you enlisted both the Vicar and Siegfried's parts in your design. You calibrated the device to provoke fear, then studied the results with clinical interest. Colonel Melville's jaw clenched. He inclined his head. I sought knowledge, not harm. Miss Marple smiled gently. But knowledge without compassion is a precarious gift. The broken saucer, the trembling hand, and the triumph in your voice betray the deeper truth. She turned to Mrs. Petherick. Clara, whose reflex revealed the first falter? Mrs. Petherick's voice trembled. I did. Miss Marple addressed the Colonel. And you, Colonel, took that revelation as proof of your theory and extended it into a demonstration for the fate. He looked about at the gathered villagers. Yes, and I am ashamed. Miss Marple folded her knitting. Shame is a proper response. Yet this fate may resume with understanding that power over emotion must be tempered by empathy. She swept her gaze across the assembly. Let us remember that in every heart lies both courage and fear, and that the truest measure of character is how we guard one against the other. As the villagers applauded softly, the air lightened. Colonel Melville offered his arm to Mrs. Petherick in apology. Reverend Clement knelt to console Eliza Stokes. Lady Carmichael embraced her brother's letters, and Raymond caught Miss Marple's eye, offering a respectful nod. The ticking had ceased for the final time, but its lesson remained. That human nature, once revealed, endures long after the gears have stilled, and that a sharp mind and a gentle heart, when combined, bring even the most hidden inclinations into the light. Chapter 10. Peace woven anew. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the village green, St. Mary Mead's fate found its gentle closure. The maypole's ribbons hung limp, the stalls were packed away, and lanterns swung in the evening breeze. Yet amidst the bustle of departure, a new sort of calm settled over the villagers, one born of understanding rather than ignorance. Miss Marple, seated once more beneath the old oak, watched with satisfaction as the final guests offered cordial farewells. Colonel Melville, his uniform jacket now unadorned by medals, shook hands with Reverend Clement in warm brotherhood. Mrs. Petherick distributed the last scones, each wrapped in soft paper. Her anxiety faded to a history she could recount with a rueful smile. Lady Carmichael handed her millinery tools to Eliza Stokes, who clutched them with respectful pride. Mrs. Blackwood packed up her jam jars, with Mrs. Fletcher pausing to taste a final spoonful of gooseberry, admitting, quite publicly, it was indeed unadulterated and delicious. Raymond West approached Miss Marple, notebook in hand, but now used for sketches rather than secrets. A remarkable day, he observed. I imagine tomorrow's chronicle will remark on more than just a garden party. Miss Marple closed her knitting reticule and offered a gentle nod. It will remark on human nature, and the lesson that the heart's cadence cannot be manipulated without consequence. Raymond grinned. I'll be sure to credit your insights. She smiled, eyes twinkling. Thank you, my dear. And now, perhaps we may join Clara and the vicar for tea in the sitting room? He offered his arm, and she accepted. Together they walked up the narrow path toward Mrs. Petherick's cottage, where warm lights beckoned through lace curtains. In the cozy parlor, Mrs. Petherick poured Earl Grey from her best china teapot. The clink of porcelain and the low murmur of conversation felt like balm after the day's tensions. Colonel Melville sipped his tea with unaccustomed reverence, and Reverend Clement offered a quiet benediction before raising his cup. Beatrice Carmichael, seated beside Eliza, traced the warp and weft of her ribbon collection. Thank you for your composure today, she said to Miss Marple. Without your guidance, I fear my family's name and my apprentice's trust would have been tarnished. Miss Marple shook her head. You acted with honesty, Beatrice. It was Colonel Melville's curiosity that led us astray, not the integrity of your workshop. Eliza looked up, eyes bright. I shall never again doubt the kindness behind this key. She patted the brass key on its ribbon. Mrs. Blackwood, spoon in hand, added softly, and I shall not let suspicion spoil my preserves. The red label remains as it was intended, a warning for children, nothing more. Miss Fletcher, who had been listening attentively, nodded. Gossip can be a useful tool, if tempered by kindness. I shall teach my pupils to verify their claims before spreading them. Miss Marple inclined her head. Wisdom well learned. She sipped her tea, letting the warmth spread. Now, I believe each of us has a story to tell and a role to play in the telling. She paused, regarding each face with gentle gravity. May we move forward with the knowledge that fear, once sown, reveals our truest selves, and compassion is the antidote. Outside, the village bell tolled the hour of dusk, its clear notes drifting through open windows. The lanterns on the green flickered one final time before being extinguished. St. Mary Mead stood in quiet repose, as if savoring a secret only its inhabitants understood. Miss Marple and Raymond stepped onto the lane beneath a pale moon. He carried her reticule. She leaned on his arm. Another mystery resolved, he said quietly, and all without a drop of blood spilled. She chuckled softly. Indeed, the darkest crimes need not be dramatic to wound deeply. It is often the small betrayals of trust, of kindness, that cut the deepest. Raymond nodded. Do you think Colonel Melville and Reverend Clement have learned their lesson? Miss Marple studied the moonlit cottages. I believe they have felt the weight of their actions. Guilt, when faced, can guide us toward better choices. She paused beneath a lamppost, its glow haloing her figure. And now, the village may rest, knowing every clock can be unwound by truth and every heart soothed by understanding. He smiled, tipping his head. Thank you, Aunt Jane, for seeing what we often overlook. She touched his arm. The world moves at the pace of its smallest moments. Observe them well, and you shall know the heart of humankind. As they walked on, the lanterns flickered out, one by one, and the final echoes of ticking faded into memory. In St. Mary Mead, peace returned, woven not from naive ignorance, but from the steady threads of honesty, empathy, and the quiet brilliance of mind that cherished every heartbeat encountered.